I was talking last time about how the church, in trying to proselytize and trying to make Western Europeans become Christian or become more accommodated to Roman Christianity, we're trying to not exactly adapt Christianity, but make it more appealing by enabling non-Christians to connect with it better. But that had its own problems because, as I said, people were often afraid that they would be distorting Christianity in the process. And one of the things that arises has to do with icons. Now, the word icon, you may think of it as being a word for one of the little symbols that you see on your laptop screen. And I actually had a student once who was asked to discuss icons on an exam, and he started talking about Hollywood icons like Beyonce. And that's not what we're talking about. That's not the kind of icon we're talking about. In the early church, especially in the East, people began to make pictures of Jesus, the Virgin Mary. As I mentioned before, paintings of the Virgin Mary are very popular in Poland, and the various saints. And this is partly because, of course, a lot of people couldn't read, and seeing pictures of what they were praying about was helpful to them. But also, I have the feeling that a lot of these, especially the people who had not been Christians, were used to praying to objects. Were used to, they had idols that they were setting up and praying to. And of course, this is not really what you're supposed to do. The second commandment, as opposed to the second amendment, which is a completely different thing, the second commandment says, "Thou shalt not have any graven images." And a lot of people were very concerned that pictures of Jesus and the saints, that people were not just using these images to remind themselves of what they were praying about, but they were actually praying to the images as if that was a focus. Well, it was a focus, but as if that was what it was all about, which it was not supposed to be what it was all about. And you have people like Leo the Isaurian, who was an Eastern emperor in the 8th century. He wasn't actually an Isaurian. He wasn't from the area of Isauria, which is why I put that in quotation marks. For some reason, he became known as Leo the Isaurian, maybe because the Isaurians were a really rough and tough bunch of people. He decided during his reign as Eastern emperor that this business of worshiping icons, of worshiping pictures of Jesus and the saints, was not okay. Various reasons for that. By this time, the Muslims had been they had arisen during the 600s in what is now Saudi Arabia, and they were beginning to put pressure on the Byzantines. And a lot of soldiers were saying, well, that's because we're worshiping icons, and everybody knows that's not a good thing. So Leo took their side and went around destroying icons, destroying the pictures of Jesus and the saints that were being used in the churches. Actually, monks were making icons popular, which is kind of ironic because the monks were supposed to be withdrawing from the world, and the monks were using the icons in order to make Christianity more popular. Today, we use the word iconoclasm and iconoclast in order to refer to people who don't pay attention to social norms, who are acting against they're marching to a different drummer and they're not paying attention to popular cultural norms. But in the 8th century, iconoclasts and iconoclasm had to do with this movement where people went around to the churches and destroyed the icons that were hanging in the churches, the pictures of Jesus and the saints. And there was a lot of resistance to that because there were a lot of people who really liked their pictures of saints. And there was rioting in the streets. It was kind of one of the big upheavals in the Eastern Church of the 8th century. And eventually, the people who wanted to have pictures in the churches won out. And of course, now there are a lot of pictures in churches, especially Catholic churches. But art historians who are studying Byzantine art have trouble in the 8th century because the iconoclasts destroyed all the church art. It's no longer available, so we have to kind of wonder what these pictures were like that were being destroyed. Um, Meanwhile, going back to the western part of the empire, um, there were attempts. The period that we're talking about from about 500 to 1100 CE is sometimes referred to by historians as the Dark Ages, and that's not really a helpful term because, I mean, it basically refers to the fact that there's not a whole lot of documentation. So we are in the dark. It's not that the people who lived in the Dark Ages were in the dark. We are in the dark. But it's also true that during this period, there was not much centralized government. There were not people who were ruling over large areas. It was mostly smaller areas, kind of, smaller than Spain and France today. And as a result, there was not a whole lot of coordination between various European populations. But there were attempts to correct this situation. And one of them was the responsibility of a man named Charlemagne. I'll have to explain a little bit as to where Charlemagne comes from. I mentioned earlier that there was one of these many groups of so-called barbarians who were invading from the east were the Franks, who started out as pagans, and then King Clovis, who was the founder of the Merovingian dynasty, married a Christian wife, a Christian queen, and converted to Christianity, the Roman Christianity. But the Merovingian dynasty, which Clovis was a part of, was replaced by the Carolingian dynasty. The word comes from the Latin Carolus, which is actually the Latin version of the name Charles. The first of the Carolingian rulers was Charles Martel, who had sort of been a palace, he's originally called the palace mayor. He was actually working for one of the Merovingian kings, but he seizes control. But the person who's really important in the Carolingian dynasty is Charles's grandson, whom we refer to as Charles the Great. In Latin, that is Carolus Magnus, and the name that actually he usually goes by is Charlemagne, which is the kind of Frenchified version of Carolus Magnus. Charlemagne was one of the people who came close during this period of the Dark Ages to recreating the Roman Empire in the West, recreating a large-scale nation with a centralized government. It didn't last after his death, unfortunately, but he was one of the people who came close to doing it. Charlemagne had conquered large quantities of territory in Europe, but most important, he was able to control that territory. He wasn't like Alexander the Great, who conquered a lot of territory and then died and was unable to maintain unified control over it. Charles was able to control his kingdom. And one of the ways that he was able to do it, and it's kind of interesting in terms of long-term European history, is that he had a bunch of kind of executives or, supporters who would go out into the various parts of his kingdom and check on how things were going. Make sure they were all still loyal to Charles. And these people traveled in twos. They were called missi dominici. One was a sheriff who was responsible for enforcing Carolingian law, and one was a priest. Now, why was a priest coming along? Because the priests were practically the only people in this period who knew how to read and write. In order to be a priest, you had to be able to read and write because you had to be able to administer the Mass. And in order to administer the Mass, you had to be able to learn from the text of the Mass what you were supposed to say. Also, the priests were the ones who read the Bible and interpreted it to the congregation. So priests were all being required to learn how to read and write. And Charlemagne and therefore, of course, when the Missy Dominici went out, the sheriff would be kind of dealing with the nuts and bolts of the visit, but the priest could write back to Charlemagne and say, "This is what's going on here. Before we move on to the next place, I wanted to let you know." And Charlemagne, if he needed to, could send messages to the priest. Charlemagne knew that this was necessary. He knew that in a large kingdom like the one that he had established, or an empire really, you needed to be able to send written messages back and forth. And he also knew that not very many people could read and write. So Charlemagne established a school. His capital city, his center of operations, was actually on the border of what today, the border between what we would describe today as Germany and France. It's indicative that it has two names that it goes by. It is known as Aachen, which is what it officially is now, because it's officially on the German side of the German-French border. But it's also been known as Aix-la-Chapelle. And the chapel, was a building that Charlemagne built. Actually, there's a picture of it in your textbook. And in that chapel, there was a school where the noblemen who served Charlemagne would learn how to read and write. The school was headed up by a guy named Alcuin, who was responsible for what historians sometimes refer to as the Carolingian Renaissance. Renaissance is a tricky term. It's been used in a lot of ways. Basically, it just means rebirth. A naissance is a birth in French. And if you were to fill out a application or some kind of legal form that said date de naissance, it would be your birthday. And a renaissance would be a rebirth, a being born again kind of thing. Not religious, but in terms of the revival of reading and writing and classical learning and all of the things that had been wonderful parts of the Roman Empire. So Alcuin started the school to teach people to learn to read and write, and also to copy manuscripts and kind of give a jump start to some kind of intellectual culture. One of the things that he did, which is still important for us today, is the monks in his establishment were writing so many manuscripts and copying so many things, and it was really slow going, because back in those days, in order to write Latin, you used all capital letters. In fact, those were the only kind of letters. If you look at the ancient Roman monuments that have inscriptions on the top, the inscriptions are all in what we today would call capital letters, but that's not because they were trying to be emphatic or anything. That was because the only letters they had were the letters that we refer to as capital letters. In Alcuin's school, in order for him to streamline the process of copying manuscripts, he invented an alphabet called Caroline minuscule, or Carolingian minuscule, which is basically what we use today as lowercase letters. So when you're writing something in capital letters and lowercase letters, you are actually writing it in Carolingian minuscule. You didn't even know that, did you? Well, let me stop this again and start a new period, because we're almost up to I tried to keep the lectures to 15 minutes apiece, so I will start this again. Now, see if that one came through.